Hey guys, this is Dan from Let's Tank, and today we are going to be looking at the Blood Death Knight on the Legion beta. Death Knights to me seem to be in an amazing spot right now, probably one of the stronger tanks out of the set. The Blood Death Knight having Gorfien's Grasp is an amazing raid tool, so your raid's probably going to want to consider having one of these absolute monsters at their own disposal. So currently the Blood DK uses 6 runes and runic power to grant the player access to use all the Death Knight's abilities. You as the player have the choice when deciding how you want to build up the runic power. You can either get it fast by spamming your 1 runic ability Heart Strike, or more slow using Marrow Rend, which costs 2 runes. So Heart Strike is our basic spender and attack. It costs 1 rune to use and generates 15 runic power. This runic power is increased to 18 if the Death Knight is stood within Death and Decay. Heart Strike also cleaves 1 additional target and 3 if you are stood within Death and Decay. Marrow Rend is our defensive spender. It costs 2 runes and generates 20 runic power, or 24 within Death and Decay, and generates 3 charges of Bone Shield. Bone Shield will reduce damage taken by 20%, as well as increase haste by 10%. This ability will stack 10 times it is consumed with any damaging attack. So once we've got all this runic power, we're going to start thinking about using our Death Strike ability, which is our main spender. Actually, I think it is our only spender, to be honest, within the base talents of the Death Knight, unless you start specking like Bone Storm and stuff like that. It's pretty much the only spender you're going to be using. Anyway, I digress. Death Strike costs 40 runic power to use. It deals massive damage and heals you for 20% of all damage done to you in the last 5 seconds. This follows into our mastery, Blood Shield, which will put a physical shield on use every time we heal with Death Strike for 55% of the base amount healed. We also get attack power from our mastery. Blood Boil is an AoE ability that hits hard and applies our dot, Blood Plague. Death and Decay is a targeted AoE ability that deals damage and increases runic power generation on Heart Strike and Marrow Rend. Death's Carcass is our ranged pull ability that also applies our Blood Plague. Consumption is our artifact ability. It is a frontal cleave ability that requires no target. It deals large damage and will heal you for the amount of damage dealt. Anti-Magic Shell is a defensive ability. It's on a 1-minute cooldown and lasts 5 seconds. It absorbs magic damage and stops any harmful application from being put on you while it's up. Damage absorbed generates runic power. Vampiric Blood is on a 1.5-minute cooldown. It increases our maximum health by 30% and increases all healing received by 30% for 10 seconds. We also have a few returning abilities. These include Death Grip, Gorfien's Grasp, which is now built into the core abilities of the Blood Death Knight and is no longer a talent, Dark Command, which is also known as Taunt, Asphyxiate, which is a 5-second single target stun, and Mind Freeze, which is also our interrupt ability. And finally, Raise Ally. Where would a Death Knight be if you can't raise someone back from the dead? Now, for my favourite and I think the coolest looking ability on the Blood Death Knight, Wrath Walk. This is a 1-minute cooldown, which is a 70% speed boost for the Blood Death Knight, lasting 3 seconds, and it also looks fucking awesome. So now let's have a look at the Death Knight's talents. So for the first tier we have Bloodworms, which is a passive, and your auto attack critical strikes have a chance to summon Bloodworms. Bloodworms deal minor damage to your target for 15 seconds and then burst heal you for 5% of your missing health. If you drop below 50% health, your Bloodworms will immediately burst and heal you. Next we have Heartbreaker. Passive, Heart Strike generates 3 additional runic power per target hit. And then finally, Blood Drinker. Costs 1 rune, it's channeled. You still parry, dodge, and use defensive abilities while channeling this ability. Drains a large amount of health from the target over 3 seconds. For the second tier we have Rapid Decomposition, which is a passive. Your Death and Decay deals damage 50% more often, and while you're in Death and Decay, you generate 20% more runic power. Soul Gorge, which is an instant and consumes your blood plagues within 30 yards, dealing X amount of shadow damage to each infected enemy, and empowering you for 24 seconds with up to 15% rune regeneration per plague. Plagues closer to expiration grant more rune regeneration. Passive of this is Blood Boil no longer applies Blood Plague. Finally, Spectral Deflection. It's a passive, and attacks that deal more than 25% of your maximum health will consume a second Bone Shield charge to further reduce the damage. The third line of talents starts with Osuere, or however you pronounce it, which is a passive, and while you have at least 5 Bone Shield charges, the cost of Death Strike is reduced by 5 runic power. Additionally, your maximum runic power is increased by 10. Blood Tap is an instant. Consume Shadowy Essence. It has a 1-minute recharge and it generates 1 rune. Recharge time reduced by 1 second whenever a Bone Shield charge is consumed. Anti-Magic Barrier is a passive. Anti-Magic Shell also increases your maximum health by 25% for 10 seconds. Next we have the 4th tier, Mark of Blood, costs 30 runic power, has a 15-yard range and it's instant. Places a Mark of Blood on an enemy for 25 seconds. The enemy's damaging auto attacks will also heal their victim for 2% of maximum health. Next we have Red Thirst. It is a passive. Spending runic power will decrease the remaining cooldown on vampiric blood by 2 seconds per 10 runic power. Then there's Tombstone, which is instant with a 1-minute cooldown. Consume all blood shield charges. For each charge consumed, you gain 3 runic power and absorb damage equal to 3% of your maximum health for 8 seconds. Your 5th set of talents are Tightening Grasp, which is a passive, reduces the cooldown on Gorfine's Grasp by 1 minute, and your Death and Decay also reduces the movement speed of enemies within its radius by 70%. Tremble Before Me is a passive. Enemies damaged by your Death and Decay have a chance to cower in place for 3 seconds, but cannot suffer from this effect more than once per 10 seconds. Damage may cancel this effect. And finally, March of the Damned, which is a passive. Wrathwalk lasts 50% longer and breaks stun, snare and root effects when cast. The 6th tier have Will of the Necropolis. Passive, damage taken below 35% health is reduced by 20%. Rune Tap, which costs 1 rune, consumes a rune to reduce all damage taken by 25% for 3 seconds. Has a 25-second recharge. And Foul Bulwark. Passive, each charge of Bone Shield increases your maximum health by 2%. And finally, the last tier of the talents is Bone Storm, which costs 10 to 100 runic power, is instant with a 1-minute cooldown. A whirl of bone and gore batters nearby enemies every 1 second, dealing X amount of shadow damage every 1 second and healing you for 1% of your maximum health every time it deals damage. Lasts 1 second per 10 runic power spent. Blood Mirror is instant with a 2-minute cooldown and it afflicts an enemy with Blood Mirror for 10 seconds. While active, 20% of any damage dealt to you is redirected to the target. And finally, we have Purgatory, which is a passive, an unholy pact that prevents fatal damage, instead absorbing incoming damage healing equal to the damage prevented, lasting 3 seconds. If any healing absorption remains when this effect expires, you will die. This effect may only occur every 3 minutes. So next, let's have a look at the Death Knight's artifacts. Weapon, which is a 2-handed axe, and it is called Maw of the Damned. And equipped it grants a consumption ability which deals massive damage and returns health to the wielder. The first golden talent is Umbilius Eternus, which is a passive, and after vampiric blood expires, you absorb damage equal to 5 times the damage your blood pay dealt during vampiric blood. The next golden talent is Unending Thirst, which is also a passive. While Blood Shield is active, you gain 50% leech, and damage dealt by Death Strike is increased by 50%. The final golden talent is Skeletal Shattering, which is again a passive, and each time Blood Shield absorbs damage, it has a chance equal to your critical strike chance to absorb an additional 8% of the damage. Next, we have some single talent points we get. The first one's Sanguinary Affinity, which you can only put 1 point into. It's a passive and increases physical damage done by 8%. The next one's Mouth of Hell, which again is a passive, and Dancing Rune Weapon summons a second copy of Maw of the Damned. While Dancing Rune Weapon is active, your Marrow Rend will generate an additional charge of Bone Shield. The next one's Blood Feast, again a passive, and Heart Strike heals you for 25% of the damage it deals. And finally, Rattling Bones, which again is a passive, and Marrow Rend has a 30% chance to generate an additional charge of Bone Shield. Okay, so now we've got the talents out the way. The Maw has a cool little feature built in that reads, the Maw of the Damned has feasted on the souls of a non-elite humanoid or demon creature, providing a 1% damage increase. This effect does actually stack. So let's have a quick look at the different skins for the Morse. So there's 4 different types you can get, each with 4 different colour schemes. They pretty much go, you have a blue shade, a green shade, a purple shade, a black shade, and a red shade. So there's 4 different types. We have Maw of the Damned, we have Bloodmaw, Soul Reaper, and Executioner. My personal favourite, Soul Reaper in black, or even the green shade. The green shade kind of reminds me of the Darksiders skin. If anyone ever played Darksiders, it reminds me a lot of Death's actual scythe from that game. It's a really cool looking artifact weapon, and it is a little bit hard to unlock. You have to get Glory of the Hero to get the black scythe, for example, which does add a little bit of value to getting the skins for that EPing, bragging rights feel. So let's have a look at the overall gameplay of the Blood Death Knight. Currently, they're easily one of the stronger tanks. This is for a few reasons. The main one being the amount they're actually healing for. They're keeping up with some of the weaker healers in dungeons and also in the raiding environment. Their overall gameplay is actually very fun for a new person to Blood Death Knight. Maybe not so for a more veteran player of the Blood Death Knight, but personally I was having a ridiculous amount of fun while leveling and doing dungeons on my Blood Death Knight. There was very few times I actually felt threatened as a tank that I was gonna die, even when mispulling or having a few extra packs on me. All I had to do was pop Vampiric Blood and I was pretty much invincible. And the actual learning curve of picking up the Blood Death Knight and being able to go into heroics and mythics was not too steep. It was actually really easy, especially once you figure out that Vampiric Blood, if you spec it to have the shorter cooldown by using your runic power to reduce its cooldown, that you can pretty much have it up for every other pull, then you pretty much just face roll the class. You just drop a Death and Decay, spam Heart Strike or Marrow Rend if you need the defensive power, and you're pretty much good to go. It's very, very unlikely that a DPS or healer is going to rip aggro off you, especially with the charge of Blood Boil. If you use Blood Boil once, you're pretty much not going to lose aggro on anything. The only real negatives that I'm going to say about the Blood Death Knight is its defensive abilities are very, very minimal. Say to something like a Druid or even a Warrior, you don't really have a solid active mitigation. You could say the Blood Shield is one, but it's very, very small, especially with the gear we're going to be going into the first tier with. Then our blood shields are only going to be 100k to maybe 200k when our health pools are in the millions. It's kind of ridiculously small compared to, say, a shield block or Ignore the Pain from a Warrior, for example. So it would have been really nice to, instead of have the consumption ability from the artifact weapon, to have maybe another like mitigation ability or have Rune Tap actually built into the Blood Death Knight instead of having to put a talent point into it, which would have just give the Blood Death Knight that little bit more. So as a summary, overall the Blood Death Knight is really awesome. For a new tank, it is easy to pick up and play with not too much to hold you back from doing any of the harder content like Mythics or Mythic Pluses. And for a more veteran tank, there are a few mechanics within the Blood Death Knight that will keep you entertained enough to want to play the class to its fullest. Thanks for watching my video on the Blood Death Knight on the Legion Beta. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hopefully in the next few weeks I'll also be putting out a few raid test bosses and